On this episode of the show, I have with me Heather Cassar. She is the VP of People at NARMI. We're going to be talking about feedback, and we're going to talk a lot about what goes into really generating useful feedback, the benefits, really how to get it a top-down process, and really where the benefits lie within the employee experience, the impact on retention. And she said something really interesting that we're going to dive into. She said it only gets as weird as you make it. And we're going to talk to her about what she means about that. Heather, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks, Amir. I love the podcast, and I'm really honored and privileged to be here chatting with you.
Well, thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it. This topic I love, feedback. I love feedback loops. I love to understand the constructs of what makes things tick at a company. Let's just maybe start off and talk about high level constructs of feedback. Everyone's going to have their own process. Love to kind of just hear how you approach it, just top level in terms of, where's the frequency, who's typically the stakeholders that you're looking to be the feedback provider, the audience, all those little details so that we know kind of the lay of the land.
Yeah. So, there's so many books, there's Radical Candor, there's articles all over HBR and New York Times about how to give feedback. And there's a lot of duplication in those articles because there are a few things that just work really well. And so they're kind of repeated over and over. So I'll talk a little bit about maybe some of those and then a little bit about kind of what I do as a manager and as a leader that maybe is a little bit different. So I think the first thing with feedback is that it should happen. First and foremost, it should exist, right? And feedback, and we're talking not only about the stuff that helps you, sort of correct something or get better, but the things that you do really well, right? And I think a lot of high performers, they sort of excel at their company and they get a promotion or they get a raise, and then their manager's kind of all right, you're good over here, and I'm going to stop paying attention to you, and you'll be fine because you've always been fine, and I'm going to go focus on this person over here who is failing and they need to go on a PIP or we want to exit them or something like that. So feedback should be about both the things that are constructive and help you get better, and should be focused, really a lot of your feedback should be focused on the people who are amazing on your team and who are doing really well to kind of help them get better, but also reinforce some of the behaviors that they're showing. I also think feedback should be always in real time or as close to real time as you can get. There's lots of situations where it's just not appropriate to pull somebody aside in the middle of a 30-person meeting and say hey, Amir, I really hated that thing that you did in front of everybody else, right? But maybe, later that afternoon or the next day, we are really bad as human beings at just remembering things. So the sooner we can do it, it's the better received the feedback is. And then the last thing I would say is that feedback should be as detailed as you can get it and should have some sort of action at the end of it, right? So when we were in that meeting, you were presenting some information and I could see that other people in the room just didn't really get it. Did you notice that? Did you see that happening? Okay, great. It sounds like you noticed it too. How do you think we could work together in the future to sort of get that, make sure that people get it and what you're saying resonates in the room? Okay, great. So you're going to send a pre-read and you're going to make sure that you sort of pause and check for confirmation as you're going through the presentation. Great. That's your action. I'm going to come to the next time that you present something so I can observe it myself and give you a little bit of feedback after that so you can keep getting better, right? That's the thing. It happened right after that imaginary meeting and presentation. I assessed with the person together. Hey, did you see that? Did you see it together? Right. So we're kind of on the same page. Because if they said no, they were no, Heather, I nailed it. That was the best presentation I've ever gave. My feedback might change a little bit to, okay, let me help you understand why maybe it wasn't and kind of what was going on in the room and how we can be more aware of that. And then ended with an action, right, of what that person, what my employee in that imaginary scenario was going to do, and what I was going to do to support them as their manager. So I think those are some core sort of principles to giving feedback. Some of the things that I do in my practice, I've worked at remote and hybrid companies since 2020. And one of the things I think we forget about in those companies is human connection when you're remote all the time. And we have these one-on-ones and they're 30 minutes long and we just jump right in and it's here's your agenda. Let's talk about the things and work. We are here to work. And we forget about that human element. So in my one-on-ones, I like to sort of work in time for, probably not allowed to use the word on this podcast, but we'll call it smack talk. And what that is just a little bit of time to sort of catch up with people, right? We're not talking about anyone else, but it's the things that you would normally get to connect on when you're in the office that you don't get to connect on always when you're working remote. So just what happened over the weekend? Tell me about that vacation you took last week. Send me a picture of your kid's first birthday. Tell me, you just got a puppy. Like, are you sleeping at night? Are they potty trained? What does that look like? And one of the reasons why I like to do that is because it builds trust. And when you have trust with someone, when they give you feedback, you trust the person and you trust what they're saying. And it allows you to kind of lower your defenses a little bit and really believe what they're saying and think about how you can take action to change it. So that's one of the things that I like to do that's maybe not written about so much in the books or the articles, but I think has a dramatic impact on how you can give feedback, and how folks can receive it from somebody that they trust.
I love that. You said something in particular I want to go back to because I don't know if everyone does this. If they do, we're confirming it. If you don't, something new. You mentioned when you want to provide feedback, before just going, here's what I think, and here's what you can do. You said you check to make sure you get their point of view. Yeah, in the example you provided, you wanted to understand if they thought the presentation went well or didn't go well, so you would understand their perspective, because obviously from their point of view, they might have thought it was smashingly great presentation, and you're thinking it's not, or maybe they actually understand it's not. You change your feedback. I think actually that's critical within the feedback process, because I think a lot of times feedback puts people on the defensive. I think you, as I understood it, you want to make sure they understand we're on the same team, and you want that common ground, not just to come, quote unquote, come at somebody with feedback.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's, we all have either been in this situation before, kind of like your friends and colleagues that you're talking to, when they're like, "Oh my God, my manager just will not let up." Like, I know that I need to get better at this. We've already talked about it, and they just keep saying it. That's the difference between that conversation with your manager and being like, "Yeah, my manager's like kind of great. Like, they're helping me to, like, we worked on this thing together. We felt like a team. They're going to help me at the end of that." And that question of kind of, did you see that too? Did you observe that too? Did you feel that too? That is the way that we work together. When you just kind of like launch in with like, here's the things you need to do, and here's my list, and like, let's get better at it. I don't know, it just can feel kind of like it can put people on defensive and just feels like a little crummy. Like, it's just like not a nice way to be spoken to. And it kind of goes back to that trust thing, but it's a small nuance, but it's a really important one, is to kind of check for agreement. And it changes the way you give feedback. So if someone says, "No, I nailed it. That was the best presentation I've ever given, like 10 out of 10, no notes," then that's a different way for you to give feedback. And you're going to have to dig in a little more to help them understand why you're having the conversation in the first place.
Love it. I want to dive in to something about hiring managers and kind of how you work with them. I actually want to come back to a few things we talked about, but I do want to include this as well, because what you just described, I agree with you. I think it's fantastic. I think executing it is a whole different
Yeah.
problem, because, as you said, it's only as weird as you make it is in reference to feedback. And the challenge is how do you get the rest of the hiring team, the managers, the executives in charge, all the people who actually are responsible for employees, to be able to have what you just described, that kind of comforting trust environment, so that people can feel that safe space. They can feel that the feedback is there for their benefit and not anything else. When you work with managers and executives to understand that, if they don't,
Mhm.
what are some helpful tips to have them understand why this approach is healthier?
Yeah. So let's break that into two parts. So let's talk about it's only as weird as you make it, and then let's talk about sort of trust and that relationship. The it's only as weird as you make it is one of my favorite things to say, and it's something I've carried with me from job to job. And people who've worked with me for a long time, I think, are often annoyed that I say it so much. That's just not how we speak to each other, and it's not how we talk to each other in the workplace. And so if you make it weird, it will feel weird. What we really mean by that when we're talking about documenting is just use the language and use the systems that you use for every other part of your work, and just write down what you said. So it's, if you're the manager, Amir, you're in Slack because you use Slack all day long, and I'm your direct report, and you're giving me some feedback, and you're like, hey, Heather, thanks for that chat today. Really appreciate that we got to be on the same page. I'm just going to write out a few things that we said. Here's bullets 1, 2, and 3. We agreed that this is a place where there needs to be some improvement, and here's how I'm going to support you. Like, see you tomorrow. That's it, right? We already talk in Slack every day, all day long. It's our sort of natural working environment. Just use that one, right? And if the feedback starts to get like pretty intense and we're sort of trending towards like, we might be, looking at a termination kind of thing, maybe you take a screenshot of that Slack message and you send it to your HR person so you can kind of capture it. But it doesn't need to be this like formal, complicated note. So that's kind of what I mean when I say it's only as weird as you make it. And I think that, in order to receive feedback in a way that doesn't feel super defensive and in a way that resonates, I go back to that relationship of trust. I think it's really difficult to give somebody feedback that that they won't want to hear if you don't have an established relationship with them. And really that established relationship goes back to spending time with them, getting to know them as a human being one-on-one. If this doesn't come naturally to you, like ChatGPT can help you get some questions that you can ask in your one-on-ones of like, how to get to know people. It doesn't come naturally to everybody, and that's okay. But you have to get to know the people on your team as human beings. And what you really have to get to is what motivates those people, what gives them energy, and what takes away their energy. And that's how you build trust, right? Is understanding those things. So when you talk to them, if you know that what someone's motivation is, the thing that really gives them energy is to be well respected by a senior leadership team. When you give them feedback, we can go back to that imaginary presentation example. When you give them feedback, you can say, hey, we have our CEO in that meeting. And I know that it's important to you to be like, that's a position you want to have one day. I know that it's important to you that that person respects you. I don't think the message you conveyed is going to get that across to the CEO. So let's talk about how we can do that, right? So I understand that's that person's motivation. And I understand that's what kind of gives them energy and drives their work forward.
Fantastic. Just a question. This is maybe part of the feedback process, but maybe it's the more formal side of it. When we think about performance reviews, I feel like the term itself makes it feel like it's a very grandiose, we have to come with a more robust thing, and it's done in a longer frequency than maybe some of the feedback we're talking about. But I do think it is hard for managers sometimes to flip that switch back and forth of, though this is something I can include in the performance review, and it's almost as though it can be pushed off for a little bit of time, either for observation or not to deal with it, or for the sake of time. And I do think there's something here. I was kind of curious just to hear your thoughts on when you're thinking about feedback, and obviously you mentioned the sooner the better, and have a detail, have an action, and you think about performance review. Is there a little bit of confusion? Is there a little bit of muddying of the waters between these two?
100%. I don't use a lot of like never statements at work, but I never think that you should wait to include feedback in a performance review. Even if your performance review is happening tomorrow, you should not wait to include the feedback. Performance reviews are not my favorite thing. I'll say annual performance reviews, I should say, aren't my favorite, because what happens is exactly what you've just articulated, where some managers will wait for that one time a year or 2 times a year where they say, hey, you know what? It's just a little bit easier for me not to have this conflict throughout the year. Maybe it's not so bad and the feedback isn't so big. And I'm just going to kind of like wait to put it in the review. And then I can have one difficult conversation and then I don't have to do it like 5 or 6 times. And isn't that better for me? And like, isn't that better for our relationship? But actually what happens in reality is that the employee receiving that feedback is surprised by that feedback. And that surprise immediately degrades any of the trust that you've worked on building, right? It's really hard to trust someone who surprises you with feedback that is often tied to your ability to get promoted and your compensation raise, right? Like, so now my manager, like, I could have worked on this. I could have had time to fix this. And now like, I'm trying to provide for my family. I'm trying to like have, I have certain financial goals and I'm not going to be able to meet those because I didn't get a raise this year based on something that I could have fixed 6 months ago. So never, ever wait until the performance review to give the feedback. And that, surprising people is just, it's the quickest way to degrade trust. And it's really hard to come back from that. So I think that, even if your performance review is tomorrow, still give the feedback today. And performance reviews are also usually a little one way, right? So it's kind of like, hey, I'm your manager and I've already decided this stuff. At some places I've worked at, I decided it a month ago because I had a deadline in the system and I had to submit this thing. And now I'm like released to have the conversation with you. And so not only have I already decided it throughout the year, I already wrote it down and like my boss has already seen it and the HR person's already seen it. And it's like kind of like codified into this thing, right? So if you're receiving that feedback and you're like, wait, I don't know that you have all the context there, or I'd love to, sort of respond to that. You don't really get an opportunity to do that as the person receiving feedback. And that's another way to degrade trust, right? Where it just feels a little bit one way. You're like, well, I guess, maybe I shouldn't even bother next time since you've already made up your mind about this. And so that's a big reason why I say give the feedback now.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I actually, my 10th grade English teacher taught me something that I apply to a lot of things. My daughter is like, it's almost too much, but he said repetition implies pattern, pattern implies theme. I think when it comes to performance reviews, it's very much what you said. It is a repetition, a pattern, and a theme, and you get to see the theme. And I think, obviously, it's not going to happen based on what I want, but I would love to see these one-on-ones, these feedbacks that are done on this frequent basis, be the repetition bar, so somebody can see that pattern, they can see the theme. I think the notion of a performance review should be is we don't need to decide anything. It's all right. You know what's going on. You have all the visibility. You know if you deserve a promotion or a raise because you know exactly what's been happening. It should just be, actually, you tell me, do you deserve the raise? I mean, we all know. I don't think that happens because it does take time. And I do actually think the one thing that I think managers, it's a challenge. I think the balance of I need this person to do work for me so we can deliver. I want a healthy working relationship. I think that weird part is very hard, especially in super maybe technical environments where you're judging code, you're judging how much quality of code, and you're judging, I know engineers can go, well, this was written better than the other. This is more efficient. I'm an ex-software engineer, so I'm like, that's a little bit more art than science. I mean, who can really say one piece of code's that much better than the other piece of code? Okay, maybe to degrees we can tell, but there's nuances there, and who's to judge those things? And I think it becomes difficult, especially working for a technology company. When you look at this top-down view of, okay, we just talked about performance reviews, it's a big reveal at the end, feedback, continuous is good. How do you imprint this on the culture so that it becomes just part of the organization, just part of how companies operate? I mean, what have you seen for that to work?
Yeah. I don't think a lot of companies do this well because it's really hard.
Yes.
And there's not a formula. Like you talked about art versus science, there's not a formula, which is like, first you do this, then you do this, and then this thing happens. And you asked this question about sort of like, what do you recommend? I think the reason why it's so hard is because you have to do it differently for different parts of your organization. And you have to go back to that motivator. You have to understand what motivates people. So I think one way to do this really effectively is to help tie back to your business outcomes and to really lean in on if this person is performing at the top of whatever rating system we have or whatever career framework we have, what does it look like and how does it impact the business? Right? That's a motivator for some people, especially folks in like executive roles. Like that's what your CEO wants. Your CEO wants to know how is what you're doing impacting the bottom line and making us more money. So you have to tie that back to feedback. So if you give someone feedback that they understand, are able to implement and take action on, they are better at their jobs. And if you're better at your job, you're more productive. And if you're more productive, you're making better products for the people, the customers that you serve, right? So business outcome is a big one. I think the other thing, like to go back to trust. So think about other motivators across your company, right? Do you have friction between two organizations, right? Like very commonly, like engineering, product, and design, that kind of three-legged stool, there's often a lot of sometimes healthy friction between those three functions, but it can really quickly get unhealthy. And so if your engineering team won't work with your design team and your design team won't work with your product team and all the way around, you are not running a successful business. And you need to build some trust between those teams. So your head of design needs to be able to kind of sit down, the head of engineering, and say, hey, we have to push this thing forward. And I know that that's going to be tough for your team. Like, how can we support you doing that? That is feedback, right? Which is like, I am meeting you where you are. I understand the frustrations of your team and I want to support you. How do we do that together? And I think that that's like building trust is one of these motivators. And with each organization, depending on the size and stage and scope of your organization, those motivators are going to be different. And so you have to figure out like, what is the thing that motivates your organization? Business outcomes is always going to be one. Trust is always going to be one. But what else is going on in your organization, right? Use some feedback from your recent engagement surveys. Have focus groups with people to understand. I'm in a new job, and one of my favorite questions to ask that I've asked people over the last few weeks is, what do you think the goal of the annual performance review cycle is? And I've gotten a different answer from pretty much everyone. And so if we don't have alignment on the purpose that this thing serves, that takes us months to execute and to participate in, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Right? Or if the goal is like, well, we want people to advance in their careers. I'm like, great, that's not going to happen from a one time a year process. So how do we build that goal into something else that we can do throughout the year?
I'm on board with everything you said. Actually, there's something you mentioned that I strongly feel. And you mentioned not every part of the organization will have understanding or mechanisms of feedback. And you mentioned the annual performance review, talking to stakeholders, and there's not a common understanding of even the purpose. I think when it comes to employee experience, I mean, you could even pull in employee brand. To me, I think it's very hard to do it top down. I think it's very hard because accounting, finance, those employees might need a different feedback mechanism, might have a different relationship to the brand, might have different employee experience because they have different skills. And I guess engineering, and you mentioned design. I think the top down is what we see. And I think we want one thing that we can then just apply as a pattern to everybody. But I think when you said it, and this is I feel very strongly, is I do think that yes, you can have annual performance reviews. Organizationally, we have it. Now, how it's carried out when it comes to all the details, I am sure I've not worked in accounting finance, so don't want any messages from accounting finance people, but the skills required to accounting finance probably require a slightly different review mechanism, different frequency of feedback than somebody who is in engineering and potentially, let's say, in design or even marketing function, where it's very objectives driven and metrics driven type of things. I do wonder, and I know it's hard, so I'm sure that's part of the answers, but would that allow for what you said? People don't understand what that goal is, so that obviously the top down, but the bottom up, do we just not address the bottom up enough when we're talking about reviews?
I think so. I think because a lot of companies are trying to find a way to have, like, there's this like carrot and stick approach, right? And I think a lot of companies are starting with the stick, which is like, it's going to come top down, and the person who leads this people team, or I, the person who leads this organization, am going to require you to participate in a process. And if you don't participate in the process, something is going to happen that you won't like, right? Like maybe your performance review as a manager is dependent on like you giving everybody else theirs, or your pay raise, or your ability to get promoted, whatever, some of those things. And there's definitely a time and place for like stick mechanisms, but I don't think we think enough about like the carrot, which is like, you will perform, like you will get more money, you will perform better, you will do better as like a person, as like a professional in the workplace, if you're able to get feedback. I also think that like the bottoms up, like it's just not that big of a deal. It's just like, it just isn't. Like I said at the start of this, like there's books, there's articles, there's studies, like there's so many things that kind of make it sound like a big deal, but it's just a really simple process. It's just being a human being, acknowledging that something has happened that shouldn't have happened or should have happened in a different way, and having a conversation about it. And I think we kind of build it up sometimes. And so it feels, the bottoms up is like peer to peer. I think for most people, it feels super weird to give their peers feedback, because we build rapport with these people. We build relationships. At smaller companies, it's like, I'm your kid's godfather and we go on vacation together. And like, like it's like, like real relationships outside of work. And that can make that feel even worse, that kind of peer feedback. But it's actually, if you're genuinely friends with someone and you care about them, it's even more of a reason to give them feedback. And you already have the trust, you already have the rapport. It's actually a lot easier to do, to just be like, hey, you want to go get a coffee? And as you're walking to get a coffee, you're like, hey, that was like kind of not great, that thing that happened last week, right? And the person you're walking with is like, oh my God, I've been thinking about it the whole week. I'm so stressed about it. You'd be like, how can I help you? I'm your friend. How can I help you? That's it. That is an act of feedback. And I don't think most people think about it in that way. I don't think it resonates in that way for people, where again, it's only as weird as you make it. They're thinking they have to like put it in a performance review at a one time a year, and I don't want to hurt my friends' feelings, and it might be anonymous, it might not be anonymous. I have to decide on a rating scale, right? Like those are kind of like big, heavy things. It's just not that big. It's not that heavy.
I love it. I think great insights. I appreciate the time, Heather. And I mean, we could probably do a part 2 or in part 3 and still not run out of things to talk about, but I know you got to get back to it. If somebody does want to follow up with you, ask you something that you spoke about on the show, what is a good way of doing that?
Yeah, I'm all over LinkedIn. So Heather Cassar at LinkedIn. You can email me, heather@narmi.com. I'd love to answer your emails. And I'm in the New York City area, so I'm always up for coffee chat or to get together live if anyone listening is in the same place.
Awesome. Definitely appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Amir.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for this episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, 2 things. We talked about feedback, and pretty much is not scary. I think Heather walked us through a lot of the mechanisms that she believes in, and continuous feedback, not worrying about that performance review until literally waiting till it's too late to actually tell somebody what the feedback is. And we talked about the carrot and the stick, document your conversation, and how to help the executives and managers actually deliver feedback easier, building that trust. And I think Heather covered a lot of things, but please share this episode with somebody else who might benefit from it. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the show's going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.